Oh my God, that was so wonderful.
Thank you.
I'm thrilled that you read the section with the bird partner.
I saw him in Lahore.
Yes.
And I didn't know who he was, what he was doing. It's like those candles that you burn in the church.
You know, I remember, I think somebody had written a review of your work that I saw, and they talked about that as being part of your magical realism. And it never occurred to me that that was magical realism. That just that made all kinds of sense to me. Now, if you allow a doubt about the existence of God in your mind, you need a really impressive bird. You've just admitted to this whole audience that you're an atheist. So what would you need to free a herd of ostriches? Maybe the bald eagle that attacks Donald Trump. If you release him, you're forgiven of all your sins.
Okay. I don't know what to say.
I wanted to start out, you know, my introduction to your work was reading The Blind Man's Garden. And I was reading it in advance copy. I was reading it in Central Park. And my parents were living in Boston at the time. And I got a text, and I was in the midst of the section of the school.
Oh God, I know what you're going to say.
A terrorist attack in the novel. And I got a text from my brother, one of my brothers, saying, "Mom and Dad are okay." And of course it was the Boston bombing.
Yeah.
And it was, you know, I had this, you know, of course you go to the news when something like that happens. And you have these very shocking, horrific images, and this very thin stream of information, right? Just the barest details, you know nothing about who did it, or you know, or even the people who really suffered. You just have these really viscerally upsetting images. And it immediately became apparent to me that the most useful thing that I could be reading to try and understand and to think about what an act like this means was your book. Because I was in the midst of people in Pakistan suffering at the hands of these people, people who'd been richly imagined, people who I'd come to love and care about. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the way that you see that fiction can enter in when we're talking about these sort of broad historical movements that we have such strong opinions about and oftentimes too little feeling.
Yes, I think that's the thing, that through fiction we can bring in the feeling. That's a perfect way of saying it. And growing up, I remember in the 90s, reading the newspapers, and there was a feeling of anxiety as you read the newspaper sequentially, page by page. There would be a feeling of anxiety building up. And once I had noticed it, and I then had to ask myself, well, keep an eye on the explanation for this. Why is this happening? As you begin to read the newspaper, you become more and more tense. And I don't know how the American newspapers are arranged, but in Britain, the Times, the Telegraph, and the Guardian, the national news is at the front, and the international pages are deeper first. So I was getting closer and closer to the international pages where the horror was in the 90s. That was what I realized after a few months of watching myself. Why are you getting tense as you read the newspaper? And I'm not a very quick thinker. It takes me a while to understand why I'm feeling certain things. So, but now, as you said, it happened in Boston. So now the horror is on the front page. And the thing fiction can do is that it can make a human being from the ground up.
Yeah.
And it can tell you what is his favorite food, the size of his shoes, what makes him gasp at night. Sometimes there's a memory that comes and you think, oh, I wish that hadn't happened. So all of that, layer by layer, he went to this school, that happened, layer by layer. And to say that during the Zia regime in the 1980s, X number of people were tortured. That's one thing. That's the job of nonfiction. For fiction creates a man from the bottom up, and then it takes him or her into the torture chamber.
Right.
And not only that, it creates the next person, the person who loves this person. So not only do we see this, it also, if I can read, so not only do we see his pain, but we see this other person's pain, which isn't nonfiction's job. Even does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes. It's on. I wrote about this when I was looking at a painting by Giotto, a crucifixion, and this was in my notebooks. And when I was writing this, it happened. So I'm sure we've all seen. We all know Giotto's crucifixion. So somebody's looking at a painting. The crucified Christ and the weeping figures at the foot of the cross. They are his mother and his friends, and they are weeping because this, the crucifixion, is taking place. And it is powerful because the suffering of the tortured man and the suffering of those watching him are in the same picture. They are in the same glance. Injustice is not occurring in a distant hidden pocket, and the grief of the victim's relatives is not in a far-removed place, disconnected from the crime. He will die, and those who love him are watching, and all of it is being watched by us. This is what fiction can do. I can put you in here, I can put myself in here, and then I can force them to look at us.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
And you know, you're talking about the need for the artist to think about the experience of the interrogated, the tortured. And, you know, there's a scene like that where one of the characters is at the hands of the Americans. And there are sort of euphemisms with which we like to talk about the techniques so that we can feel better about them. And then there's the job of fiction, which is explaining what it feels like.
Yep.
You can put any label that you want on it, but I'm going to show you what it feels like.
Absolutely. It's and one of the I've said this before, but I have to repeat myself because I feel very strongly about this. One of the most humiliating things. You're an artist yourself. You're a storyteller yourself. One of the most humiliating things over the past decade and a half has been the corruption of language that has taken place at the hands of the powerful. So once again, I will talk about both sides. In that, the American regime keeps talking about this thing called enhanced interrogation. What they mean is torture. Say it. Use the correct word. They mean, extraordinary rendition. That's called kidnapping. So use it, and that's my job as a writer. And it is happening on the other side too. So the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and now the ISIS are talking about something called jihad. The word jihad has as many meanings as a rose has petals. To be nice to someone when you don't feel like being nice is jihad. To give someone money when you don't have money yourself, when you can't spare it, is jihad. So as a writer and as a storyteller and someone who loves words, that is where then you have to come in and you said, I have to defend the thing I love. I have to say, I will use the word torture. I will use the word kidnapping. And I will try to unpack this word jihad, and I will say, no, not just that. Look at these other petals. If no, so
and there's the love for both sides, and then the willingness to look honestly at both sides, which comes in, and this is the other reason that I love the bird partners, because there's something so beautiful about it, so wonderful that God has to listen to the prayers of the weak, and then immediately the logic doesn't quite work because you have to capture the bird. And I was thinking there's another passage about the same character where he's thinking about the war in Afghanistan, and his son is going to help with the humanitarian costs.
That's right.
But the father, who is a very conservative Muslim, but not a jihadi, which is an important and very radically different thing. There's a passage where we write, he knows that had he been a young man himself, he would not have stopped at Peshawar. He doesn't know how he would have resisted entering Afghanistan, and not just for help and aid, he would have fought and defended with his arms. And yes, had he been present in the United States of America back in September, he would have done all he could to save the blameless from dying in those attacked cities, partaken in their calamity. How not to ask for help these days from others, from God, when it seems that one is surrounded by the destruction of the very idea of man. And it seems to me that in that passage you have so many of the good characteristics of this character, right, are also the ones that as a younger man would have sent him to war.
And also he would have prevented the idea, and he would have done everything he could to prevent 9/11 from happening.
Yes.
So he sees the invasion as unjust.
Yeah.
Do you understand?
Yeah.
He sees the American invasion as unjust. It's once again, these are very old stories. I think of Coleridge. Think of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. We don't really know in that poem why the albatross is shot. There are vague hints, but that is just speculation. But it's an albatross around your neck. So the idea is don't do something unthinkingly. And Coleridge hadn't been to sea yet when he wrote that poem, and he did go to sea at the beginning of the 19th century. He went towards Malta in a group of ships. An eagle landed on deck while he was watching it. While Coleridge watched, one of the other seamen took a shot at the bird, and the bird flew off. And Coleridge said that he could hear, as the bird flew away, he could hear more and more fainter and fainter gunshots coming from because other men were shooting at it. And he said that it was non-feeling from non-thinking. That's the idea. So, and that once again goes on both sides. You must remember this. That the idea of him saying that the invasion of Afghanistan is unjust. Try to do something about Al Qaeda. And we know how many people died in the American invasion.
Right.
And the same thing here. So that was precisely what I was trying to get at.
It's funny you mentioned the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. It was the first poem I ever tried to memorize, and that became a really big thing for me, memorizing poetry. When I was in Marine training, which is a lot of, marching and sitting behind your rifle, I would pull out cards with poetry that I'd written down and try and memorize things, and I memorized the waistband. That was a very important education for me as a writer. I know that you would copy out entire books.
I was learning to write.
You copied out Moby Dick.
I did.
Yeah.
I did. I wanted to know where the comma fell. I wanted to know where the full stop was. I wanted to know how many thoughts are allowed per page, how many, I mean,
How many thoughts are allowed per page?
if you are Melville, thousands.
A lot.
It's well, I mean, it's. If you look at Jackson Pollock,
Yeah.
it's busy everywhere. You know, there's energy everywhere. If you look at someone like Mark Rothko,
Yeah.
it's still, and which none of them are actually against. Neither of them actually negate the other.
Right.
It just depends on what you feel like doing, what the artist feels like doing, and we have to trust the artist.
I wanted to go back to this. You talk about sort of having a foot in both sides. In your second novel, in talking about things, working on things slowly, you spent what, 11 years?
Well, I was copying Moby Dick as well.
Over and over again. Go ahead. Go.
When I came to Britain, I had no English.
Yeah.
So I went to university to read sciences. But during my third year at university, I realized that my English was now good enough. I'd been in Britain now for 7 years. To do what I really wanted to do, it was to be a writer. So I dropped out and began writing my first novel. I didn't tell my parents. It was in January, and the exams were in June, and every few weeks I would get on the phone and say, revision is getting, exams are getting near. And then the exams came, and I rang them up and said, I think I did well. And then I did get a 2-1. I got a really good degree, and all the while I was working on a novel. And once I finished the novel, I was living in the provinces. I come from a small town in England, and I didn't know how to have a book published. So the writers I loved, V.S. Naipaul, John Updike, Gore Vidal, Timothy Moore, Jean Rhys, they were published in Britain by a firm called Andre Deutsch. So I picked up a copy of Naipaul's Bend in the River, looked at the copyright page, and got the address, and sent them the manuscript. And 10 days later, I got a phone call saying, I am V.S. Naipaul's editor, and we have your novel. Come and talk to us. And I said, I can't. And they said, why not? And I said, I have no money. And they said, we'll give you money, borrow some, and come and talk to us. So I went, and they said, we will publish it. We'll publish your book. Do you have another one in you? And I said, yes. And they said, now go and begin work on that. So once the book was accepted, I said to myself that because I couldn't do my junior high in the subjects I wanted to do, which was English, history, politics, etc., sociology, philosophy, because I couldn't do my high school, I couldn't do my BA, I couldn't do my MA in the subjects I wanted to do. Now I'm going to do them. So I would go to person A, and I would say to them, who is a great novelist? And he would say, Faulkner. So I would go to the library and get all the Faulkner's books out, and I read everything by Faulkner. I would go to person to another person and say, name a great writer. Henry James, Thomas Hardy, George Eliot, Jane Austen. I read them all. So that was my education over those 10 years, and that's the 90s, which I spoke about when I was saying that I already had the idea that I was going to write the Afghanistan novel, and I didn't know how to take the Americans back yet. So that was what happened. And you mentioned earlier that I'm not religious. People always ask, what is the book that changed your life? You know, they always say, it was my high school biology textbook. That it was being in junior high, this is still in Pakistan, where the only dominant narrative is that God created the world. Yeah. You're not so, and suddenly I was being given this alternative. And that was thrilling. And that was the first year that that students in junior high were being taught biology. And I know that my Islamic teacher left the school. He was outraged. And I think versions of that are happening here, that, we don't, creationism, etc., etc. And so eventually, as the years went by, we left, and as the years went by, and I now know that during the Zia regime, so they were still angry that sciences were being taught. And so they found a way around it so that two atoms of hydrogen and one atom of oxygen come together to form one molecule of water, right? Now, in the Pakistani textbooks, it says 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 atom of oxygen come together if God wills to form one molecule of water. So religion is even in science. But to go back to the idea of religion, I am an atheist, yes, but I got the idea of consequence from religion, and I am grateful for that. And now that lesson can enter a child's life through any means, and if I had a child, it would enter through different means. But given my life, the idea that if you do something bad will happen to you. Spiritual damage will occur, which is what Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner we're talking about. Not that you will be avenged, that you will suffer spiritual damage. And they're just mechanisms for bringing and keeping ideas alive in the world. The idea of Christianity, the idea in Christianity, which I find deeply moving, is that before Christ, the idea that I had to be good to you because you were my brother wasn't there. I had to be good to you, that idea was there. I had to be good to you because you were my friend, you were another human being, you were my neighbor, you were, right? But the idea that I had to be good to you because you were my brother, and he and her and him and her, all of us, that idea wasn't there before Christ, as far as I understand it. And I think that's a phenomenal thing. It's a tiny alteration of the idea we already have, which is that be good to him. But no, be good to him because you are related to him, because he is your brother. And this is how ideas come into the world. So I am an atheist, yes, but nothing stops me from gaining strength from wherever I can find it.
And we were talking about this earlier, that in terms of our parents, we have a similarity. I have a mother who's a practicing Catholic and a father who's an atheist, and you had that different religion, similar division among your parents. What was their relationship? You talked about, you're doing this in secret. When your book came out, when you were a writer for real?
Oh, they were like, my father wanted to be a poet himself.
Yeah.
And because the setup he grew up in Pakistan, in that society, there really wasn't much choice. When he was 23, 24, for him to get married, it was automatic that a marriage will be arranged for him. And then we came along very quickly. So when I was 24 and I was saying, I'm going to sit down and read everything D.H. Lawrence wrote, that wasn't a possibility for him, because he had children, he had a widowed mother, and he had younger brother who he had to look after. So all my life, I noticed that there was a kind of, as I was saying to you earlier, that there was a kind of wound in my father, that he felt that his real life didn't happen. And so, in the universe of my novels, the great Pakistani poet is named after my father. So I've done for him in the universe of my books what he couldn't do in real life because of me. And you say, what was it like growing up and watching them? It's been a privilege. to see that marriage, because they are the ideas that they believe in are so different. In that, I mean, we'd go to my mother's family, to her house, to her parents' house, and the walls were blank because no images are allowed. There was no music. We had to hide, and this was before Walkmans came along. That's how old I am. I mentioned Walkmans. So movies were not encouraged. Well, they were forbidden. So there was no TV. But on my father's side of the family, we were all bohemian. So in a way, I think it's a good, I mean, I have 50 first cousins. Both my parents came from very big families. And so I have an entire spectrum of what it is like to be a Pakistani. So when people say Muslims, I really genuinely have to say, which one do you mean?
Right.
Because I know Muslims who are nuclear scientists. I know a female flight instructor in Pakistani army.
Yeah.
They are related. And I also know a cousin who is totally covered up. And I also know a cousin who is totally covered up, but goes to the cinema in hiding because no one knows it's her, because she has that extra freedom. So when you say that Islam is oppressing a woman with a burqa, what do you mean by that? I'm not even sure about that. Which, as a novelist, is a great boon. It's when you think of a ray of white light going into glass, and it just comes out split into 7 colors. It depends on which side you are on. It's either white or it's an entire spectrum, and that's me. And I can't lie.
Yeah.
That's the thing also about fiction, that you cannot lie. And even if I didn't, that it would show in that fiction. We were saying, why is fiction great? Fiction is a democracy. I cannot have 4 characters and I explain 3 of them fully. I tell you about their favorite colors, favorite formative experiences, their girlfriend, their school, their university, etc., and not tell you something about the 4th one, because the reader would say, actually, well, why is this character so thin? There might be very good artistic reasons for us to withhold certain things when we are making fiction about, well, I don't want to tell you about his love affairs, but I will tell you about her love affairs, his school years, yes, but you can't do it because you're not interested in Muslims and this happens to be a Muslim character. It will show. The novel the form will take revenge on you. It will be a bad novel.
Yeah, the characters won't feel real, and then you'll have to go and fully imagine a peripheral character that you didn't want to have to care about, and all of a sudden the novel the story has to change.
Absolutely.
It's very frustrating. And it's also the thing that's most valuable, I think, about the writing process is the way that it forces that. And I think that it just is something amazing in your work. Now I see that the clock, unfortunately, has counted down. I haven't even got past page 1 of all the questions that I have for you, but it's just been an absolute privilege to hear you read and to be in conversation, and thank everyone in the audience for being here.